of Southern Africa is not empirically correct. It's not true. Okay? It's important not to set the bar too high. In 7, 8 out of 10 years, Zimbabwe did export maize and a little bit of milk, dairy products. But by and large, it imported during a series of droughts, about 6 of them, and it produced a sufficient amount, more or less, for internal consumption. So we need to be realistic about what we're talking about when we talk about bread basket. And it in fact imported 25% of the wheat consumption in the heydays. Okay. So having said that, what are the recent trends? Okay, in terms of post-land reform, around 2003, we saw 2003-2004, we saw a major decline in production in most of the crops. There wasn't a total collapse of agriculture. We have 15 major crops in Zimbabwe. 7, 8 of these crops experienced a dramatic decline. Okay? That is over 60 to 70% decline, including tobacco. The rest of them had declines here and there between 5 and 15, 20%. Some of the crops, sugar, for instance, declined in the later days, during the hyperinflationary period. This has got to do with an important fact that Zimbabwe had a more complex agrarian structure than is often discussed. It's not just a bimodal one, small so-called subsistence farmers against large farmers. You've got an estate sector, largely held by multinationals, South Africans, sugar, and so forth, and other domestic corporate tea, and so forth. Timber estates. You had the large-scale white farmers averaging around 2,000 hectares, between 1 to 2,000, depending on where you were. And then you had a peasantry, small farmers, which was also differentiated, with a small, middle-scale black farm. We had 4 types of farmers. Now, the land reformers retained these 4 categories of farmers, but increased the numbers. Fewer individual large-scale farmers, now highly diluted racially, black and white. Then you have a big chunk of around 20,000 new middle-scale farmers. These are blacks, the so-called A2. A2, and if we add the old purchase areas, small scale, we now have around 30,000 sort of middle-class farmers. Lower middle class to middle class. And then we have a small scale, what others would call a peasant agriculture. And it's important in thinking about what needs to be changed, is the policy framework that you are looking at has to be differentiated in relation to the complex mix of these groups, recognizing that the estates, for instance, produce the plantation crops of which 80% is exported. The peasants on the other extreme produce, even in the heyday of large-scale commercial farming, over 80% of the food that was consumed in the country. That is, if you discount the fact that large farmers produce most of the wheat, small farmers produce most of the maize, okay? If you recognize that much of the large-scale farm production was for exports and middle-class consumption, our group, we drank the milk and the cheese and so forth, the apples. The peasants fed themselves by and large, or with support from aid when there was droughts, state support, and the lower end of the urban markets, meat and so on and so on. Now, think about food in a broader sense. So you've got this complex agrarian structure. Land reform did not expropriate all the land. It left the estates, by and large, most of them, with very small, about 10-15% of the land subtracted. So you have this new structure, which is the thing. Now, the importance of agriculture is not agriculture in its own right. The Zimbabwean economy has an agro-industrial model that was developed into the character that it has today in the late 60s during the sanctions, the rhodesian sanctions. There's an agro-industrial structure. There's a fertilizer production, electricity generation that consumed with a big consumption in fertilizer production, and import substitution strategy, growing wheat and so forth, at what many people would have thought is uneconomic. Okay? But the farmers made money out of it. And so what we have seen with the reform, okay, is a decline in production of certain commodities like tobacco, oilseeds, okay, and dairy, which were dominated by white farmers, and wheat, and a decline, a resilience, more or less, with a small decline of peasant crops, the cotton, which was the main cash crop for the peasant, but an erratic rate of production of the main food crop, maize. The major problem with the decline of the peasant crops has been the input shortage, which has been occasioned also by the collapse of the fertilizer and chemical supply section. Capacity utilization, even today, is still around 40%, 50%. So if we're talking about recovery, we're talking about agro-industrial recovery. On the one hand, we're talking about increasing the productivity of peasants. Why is it important to really invest heavily in the small farmers? It's not for sentimental or anti-colonial reasons. It's because the aggregate demand of the Zimbabwean economy there's a lot of scope to improve it, and it has always relied on a section, the peasant production and its linkages to urban subsidies, subsidizing the urban working class. So, increasing productivity can increase demand in the agricultural sector, influencing agriculture, industrial development, employment, and so forth. So that's the main argument.
Okay,
finally,
well, I want to keep this interactive, so maybe save that point for when we.
So, final point that I want to make is,
quick.
The major, in the last 3-4 years, there has been a return of certain types of capital, especially subcontracting former merchants, tobacco merchants, at a smaller scale than before, beginning to refinance tobacco, and the Chinese in cotton and tobacco and so forth. So you have a new financing model, which is not dependent on a freehold tenure.
Okay, well, let's say that point and we'll move down the panel. Blessing, do you want to make your opening comments?
Quickly, I'm an economic historian and development sociologist, so I'm interested in the evolution of things. So I go back to look at, there was land reform in 1980, what happened to it? And one of the questions I've been dealing with is this miracle of the 80s. Can it be replicated post-2000 in South Africa with 2010? They say, feel it, it's here. Land reform happened in Zimbabwe, we have to feel it, it's there. It's not going to be reversed. The big question is, what will then happen to make that productive going forward? But in the 80s, there was actually no miracle. There was actually potential for a miracle in small-scale agriculture, which was not pursued, because whilst there was a lot of agro-populism and expectation of this sector to grow, there was also agro-pessimism around the capacity of this sector to do a lot to play its role in the economy. So most of the support in that period continued to go to large-scale commercial farmers as opposed to going to the small-scale farmers. So by 1999, you have the implosion because the miracle did not happen. So maybe the question today would be, will that miracle that could have happened happen now? And one of the answers is exactly it would, if we have not only agro-populism but an agro-optimism that begin to take lessons from the 80s and say, in the 1980s, the people who picked up land were destitute. People coming back from outside the country and within the country are much older with no resources. The people who now have land now are much younger, more educated, and with the right support mechanisms, they can actually be more productive on that land. If you look at the 1980s and 1990s, the small-scale farmers who got land did not become an important political constituency. Actually, they were only people who would be remembered for seed packages, for food when there is a drought, and when there are elections. So they were election basket of the country. Post-2000, will this new group of landowners become a big and important social and political agency that can begin to interact within policy formulation and begin to have organized way of thinking about agriculture within the context of a wider economy. One of the questions that has been raised is the Zimbabwean agrarian crisis led to an economic crisis. And I seem to think that you cannot think of agriculture doing well when the rest of the economy is not doing well, because agriculture is part of the economy. So if you think of agriculture outside the context of the broader economy, there is no way that such land benefit, any positive benefits can come from the land reform program. So my fear is that some of this pressure to get foreign direct investment, a lot of investment coming back, tends to cloud issues around agriculture by issues of trying to provide low tax breaks and benefits for companies so that they're able to come and invest in higher taxes for individuals who actually, the relationship between the urban working masses and the rural people has been that people buy fertilizers and inputs and go and support their land in the rural areas. So there is need also for the tax policy and the economic policy to think around those things in order to revitalize an agrarian economy.
Okay, thank you very much.